By the way, Sam is our IT. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to give everyone a little bit of time to settle in wherever you are joining us from the Caribbean and in the world. Welcome, and we are so pleased to have you. Just going to give everyone a little bit of time to join us, and then we will get started. And you are on the Decarbonizing Shipping webinar. You're at the right place. In case you were wondering. Excellent. So lovely to see so many of you, familiar faces, familiar names. Good morning and welcome to our special installment of the SRC Lunchtime Chat Series. This time, in order to launch the Caribbean Shipping Lanes project at the SRC, the Srinath Ramphal Center. We are so excited about this webinar because it signals the SRC's launch in a dedicated way into this big, important area of shipping. Now, this is an obvious specialization for the SRC, given the fact that our mandate is trade, and the region has a huge dependence on shipping for trade in and out of the region, as well as you'll hear, climate change. So how do these two things that the SRC cares so much about, trade and climate change, converge on the issues that we are going to talk about today? My name is Jani Vremi. I am the director of the Srinath Ramphal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy, and Services, which we call the SRC. And we are home of trade policy, focusing on training, advocacy, and research with a specific focus on the Caribbean region's interests in multiple spheres of engagement and increasingly on sustainability and that dimension of trade policy. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers and today's webinar topic, allow me to be excited and announce to you that we are launching our Caribbean Shipping Lanes webpage based on a project that is dedicated to supporting the Caribbean negotiators and negotiating policymakers in the International Maritime Organization. And for this, we have many to thank. UN Foundation, the Belize Port Authority, our close work with UCL, and our very own in the Caribbean, the Maritime Technology Corporation Center Caribbean, as well as the Caribbean Maritime University, all of whom specialize and have been working for years before we came onto the scene on shipping research and issues relevant to shipping for the Caribbean. We also want to thank those who have been working and toiling at the IMO, as well as in domestic ministries, those who support the Caribbean in the IMO negotiations, some of whom you will hear from today, and many of whom are joining us on the webinar today, as well as the important work that is being done around the world on this topic. I want to just spend literally 2 minutes to show you our website, the new website that we are launching. And it is as I mentioned, it is the Caribbean Shipping Lane website on our webpage, on our website. And if you know our SRC website, you just go to it. We now have a dedicated page called Caribbean Shipping Lanes, and you click on the Caribbean Shipping Lanes tab. And what comes up for you is a little bit about the project, our partners in the project, those who have been in the toils working, and we have some pictures and some of them in our negotiating capacities, about the project team, which is myself, Professor Troy Lord, our SRC IMO fellows who are with us and have done so much work in the background, We have Tiana Blades from Barbados and Nafisha Richardson from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we're so happy to have worked with them, and obviously the team at the SRC, in particular, Adela Lewis, Jerome Broom, and Tennille, as well as Tennille Knight, as well as Desiree and Clausel, who have done all of this work in helping us to reach this milestone in our project. So the page talks a little bit about our, gives you some facts and figures, which we will update and change constantly. It gives you a sense of the webinars. This is the inaugural one that we will be posting, and these will be continuously updated. We have a dedicated shipping lanes blogs and the first edition of a special SRC trading thoughts done by our SRC fellow Nafisha Richardson will be the first edition, but we invite you, anyone who writes or wants to write something about Caribbean shipping from a specific perspective, we encourage you to send these entries in, and we will post them, subject obviously to our editorial oversight. We've also, thanks to our partners, been doing amazing amounts of work in the last year or so, including training and workshops. The Belize Port Authority, together with the Netherlands, hosted a strategy meeting, a regional workshop earlier this year. We've also had training that the SRC hosted, again with our partners online, to CARICOM maritime officials. And just so that you don't have to look around, we are trying to converge in one space all the important IMO-related documents, submissions, and publications that you will need to know in order to get up to date with what is happening on the IMO negotiations. And that's a great segue for today's webinar. So you can just scroll on this. Again, we will keep this updated. All of the Caribbean related and our partners in the IMO negotiations will be on this website, and we will keep updating them. So join me in thanking all those responsible for putting this together. Thank you all so much, and we are so excited to be able to offer this service to the Caribbean region and its negotiators as we move on in the IMO processes. So turning now to why you're here today, let me welcome you to our webinar entitled Decarbonizing Shipping, CARICOM in the IMO Climate Negotiations. Now, this has emerged as a very important part of CARICOM engagement with international processes, but one area which all of the experts from the Caribbean will say is not getting enough focus from the region's policymakers. And this is part of the gap that we want to help fill through the Caribbean Shipping Lanes project and through this inaugural webinar to the public. So although there have been discussions in very specific places among those who already know, what we're trying to do is expand the knowledge to the public and get feedback and let them know so that we can start connecting the dots between what's happening in the IMO and what's happening on the ground in our Caribbean region. By way of background, and I've drawn heavily on that SRC Trading Thoughts that's soon coming out by Nafisha Richardson, our fellow, the IMO is a specialized UN agency which regulates global shipping, ensuring safe, secure, and efficient shipping on clean oceans. It serves 176 member states and 66 intergovernmental organizations and 85 international non-governmental organizations. It operates through key committees, including, you'll hear about this committee, the Marine Environment Protection Committee, or the MEPC, which focuses on environmental issues, particularly pollution and now greenhouse gas emissions from ships. So there was a 2018 IMO strategy which cemented the MEPC's efforts with a 50% greenhouse gas GHG reduction target by 2050. That strategy has now been updated in 2023 under a new title called the IMO Strategy on Reduction of GHG Emissions from Ships. And it sets very ambitious targets to decarbonize the shipping industry by 2050. And there are key targets from 2030, 2040, and ultimately 2050, when we want to reach, through the IMO's efforts, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 from international shipping, with the goal of completely phasing out greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible within that time frame. In addition to these targets, the strategy encourages the development and use of alternative fuels and new technologies to achieve these reductions, promoting energy efficiency and cleaner energy sources throughout the global shipping industry. In addition, the strategy specifically mentions that it is designed to ensure a just and equitable transition for developing countries, in particular small island developing states, SIDS, and least developed countries, LDCs. So in a nutshell, the strategy maintains that whenever we reach these targets, we cannot leave small island developing states and LDCs behind. But what does this just and equitable transition actually mean? This is very important for our region, since all CARICOM members are members of the IMO, and we have strategic, practical, technology interest in these negotiations. And of course, we are climate vulnerable. So add that to all the other costs and slight inconveniences, I joke, attached to that climate vulnerability. Today, I have with me an important set of persons who will talk to us about what we can expect, what we have done, and what is to come in these IMO negotiations, both in terms of our regional representation and on the ground, what we need to do to comply with these targets, but also how are we going to join with others, in particular the Pacific countries, who have been waving this flag in IMO negotiations for a very long time. I am pleased to introduce my panelists, and apologies for taking so long to get here, but I wanted to set the table adequately. Let me introduce in the order in which they will speak. First of all, from Jamaica, Mr. Bertrand Smith, who is the Director General of the Maritime Authority of Jamaica, appointed in 2024. He has over 25 years of experience in maritime and international law and has played a key role in modernizing Jamaica's maritime legal framework. He previously served as the Director of Legal Affairs at the Marine Authority, where he contributed and continues to contribute to the ratification and implementation of numerous IMO and ILO conventions. Welcome to you, Bertrand. We also have with us Mrs. Vivian Rambarath Parashram, who is a prominent attorney with over 25 years of experience in maritime law, environmental law, and corporate governance. She currently serves as the director and head of the Maritime Technology Corporation Center, MTCC Caribbean, which is hosted by the University of Trinidad and Tobago. In her role, she focuses on advancing low carbon shipping and maritime sustainability in the Caribbean region. Welcome, Mrs. Parashram. Ambassador Jerry Eno of Grenada is an influential figure in maritime and environmental sectors. He serves as advisor on the blue economy to the government of Grenada, where his expertise focuses on sustainable marine resources and ocean literacy. Ambassador Eno plays a key role in advancing Grenada's initiatives to preserve marine heritage and promote sustainable development of its exclusive economic zone. He has contributed significantly to programs integrating environment stewardship into the education system, preparing young Grenadians to be future leaders in marine conservation. Welcome, Ambassador. And last but not least, and I'll call her the sweeper today because she's going to, at the end, bring all of the thoughts together, is Miss Caroline Wills, who is the Director of Ocean and Climate at the UN Foundation, where she focuses on multilateralism and diplomacy, especially concerning climate and marine issues. Before doing this, she served as the Chargée d'Affaires at Guyana's permanent mission in Geneva, leading negotiations on fisheries subsidies at the World Trade Organization for Guyana, CARICOM, and the ACP. She also acted as chair of the WTO's Committee on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. And she coordinates the group of Americas at the World Health Organization, working on health-related matters, especially during the COVID pandemic. So if you didn't think we were very prepared for this webinar, I have to say you were sadly will be disappointed, because I think there could be no better set of persons to guide us through the discussions that we will have over the next hour. So turning first to you, Bert, and let me just pull up I see, yes, please, some appreciation for our speakers. Let me just pull up the questions that we had actually prepared for our speakers so we don't catch them unawares. So the first question goes to you, Bert, and our question is, what are some of the issues of critical importance for Caribbean countries at the IMO? And can you speak a little bit about what are the submissions that we are presenting at the Intersessional Working Group meeting coming up at the end of this month and the beginning of next month, as well as in that Marine Environment Committee that I spoke about? A little bit, if you can, about our stake in the negotiations and what we have contributed so far in terms of proposals. Over to you, Bert.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, good day, everyone. Let me first thank you, Dr. Remy from the Trinidad Ramphal Center, for hosting this webinar, and congrats on the launch of the Shipping Lanes webpage. And I can endorse what you said about the need for the Caribbean region to connect with these issues. I also want to thank the UN Foundation, Caroline, which has been a very strong partner in the Caribbean region and has played no small role in ensuring that CARICOM is a force to reckon with at the IMO. So I'll start by saying that the Caribbean region has different interests at the IMO because we do not have a homogeneous shipping sector nor a homogeneous maritime regulatory framework. So I'm just setting the context. Some of us have very large flags. And so the interest of our ship owners take a little priority. Some of us, like Jamaica, we don't have a large fleet, but we are heavily dependent on our transshipment ports or multi-cargo ports. And so we have an interest in the operators that call at our ports that may not fly our flag. Others, Jamaica including, are seafarer supply states. So our interest is ensuring that our seafarers are protected, are trained, are certificated. So, for instance, the countries with large fleets, Bahamas, Antigua, Barbados, they currently have as their priority issues that are ongoing in the Red Sea area. So security is a big issue because their ships are being attacked, seafarers are being killed, and that is top of the agenda. There are also issues of fraudulent registries. Guyana has been affected by fraudulent persons registering ships, flying their flag. So we have different interests. However, we have a common threat, which is climate change and the impact of climate change. We also have different regulatory frameworks. Jamaica has a semi-autonomous maritime authority. We can focus on IMO issues. other countries are departments in a ministry or part of the Port Authority. And so those issues also impact our ability to engage with issues at the IMO. So we have different interests, different structures, but we have some common, let's call them threats and challenges. And one, of course, is climate change. And so we all embrace the 2023 GHG reduction strategy that you mentioned. Now, this strategy is going to lead to an amendment to the MARPOL Convention. So it's not about debating issues for a policy. This is going to lead to a mandatory provision in the MARPOL Convention, an amendment to Chapter 5. And this will be critical to all of us, including states that may not have large registries. They may have oil and gas to develop, and they need that revenue to decarbonize. They also have an interest in what we're doing at the IMO. Now, once these monetary measures are adopted, they will come into force by tacit agreement. So unless an agreed number of states object, these amendments will become mandatory. At that time, we'll have no choice but to implement. And Article 1 of the convention says that we must give full and proper effect to the provisions of the convention. This means we cannot cherry pick the provisions. This will be interesting for the Caribbean region because we have a long-standing challenge in incorporating conventions into legislation, in particular MARPOL. So we have to ensure that as we negotiate, we have provisions which are globally acceptable and enforceable and do not place our economies in an adverse position. So it is critical that the Caribbean not only pay close attention to the negotiations at the MEPC, but we influence the debate, because it's very possible that these measures, which will reduce emissions from ships, may end up crippling our shipping industry and our economies. So it's an important area to focus on. Now, as you mentioned, we have submitted a paper to the upcoming intersessional working group meeting next week, actually, and to the MEPC meeting the week after. And I call these papers historic because it's the first time that the Caribbean as a group has developed a paper which it is co-sponsoring. And I think that is a major achievement for the region, because in past times, we would just be following the debate and reporting on what is happening, contributing from the floor, but essentially being led. So I'll briefly describe the papers. So as you know, the IMO GHG strategy has three main targets. We want to promote the energy transition of shipping. We want to incentivize the fleet, and we want to contribute to a level playing field and a just and equitable transition. The strategy has two elements: a technical element and an economic element. Now, the technical element is essentially a goal-based marine fuel standard regulating the phase reduction of marine fuels GHG intensity. Very technical even for persons like myself. Now, the paper is essentially a position paper on the basket of midterm measures and the impact on the Caribbean region. So it looks at the technical measures and it looks at the economic measures that we believe will result in a decarbonization of the industry, meeting our goals under the strategy. So the paper does a number of things. It highlights some of the challenges in the region. One, we heavily depend on shipping for our impact or imports, I should say, and or exports. We heavily depend on cruise shipping as well. However, there's poor connectivity between us and our global markets, which has led to relatively high freight rates. So we're at the bottom of the food chain. So any efforts to decarbonize with a levy or no levy, ship owners are going to pass those costs onto us. And there's nothing that we can do to influence those freight rates. The ships in the region are fairly old. Research shows that they're about 20 to 30 years old. So it's difficult for these ships to retrofit without some support. And of course, we've seen with Hurricane Beryl, climate change can devastate our economies, can impact our port infrastructure. It can result in almost irreversible damage. So having set the context, the paper has two things. One, technical measure involves what is called a well to wake, from production of the fuel, so it's used in the engine of the ship, it must be green. So we are supporting a well to wake approach to the GHG fuel intensity for all ships above 400 gross tons. And we believe if you have this well to wake approach, you will comprehensively address the entire life cycle of the fuels. And we will take into consideration all the environmental impacts. Now, the big issue is the universal levy. So we support a universal mandatory levy combined with this technical measure. So what is this levy? What does it achieve? So it's a levy on emissions when purchasing fossil fuels. So all ships that are purchasing fossil fuel for use will have this, let's say, carbon tax applied per ton on the fuel purchased. Now, we believe this levy will generate the funds that we need to enable a just and equitable transition for the just and equitable transition projects in the Caribbean region and other developing countries. Now, these revenues from the levy will allow our ship owners to retrofit, will allow us to explore opportunities for producing zero carbon fuels, and for us to engage in bunkering of these fuels. It will support training for our seafarers to be able to operate on vessels using these fuels or carrying these fuels, and to allow our ports to invest in things like shore power, maritime single windows, just-in-time systems to improve the efficiencies of our port. So we believe that with the mandatory levy and the technical measure, we will have revenues to allow us not to be left behind. Yes, it will impact freight rates, but it will allow for revenue to be accessed to decarbonize. And quickly, the MEPC paper.
But I'm giving you 3 more minutes to wrap up the other proposals as well, because we have 2 others.
Fine. So the other paper is the MEPC paper looking at short-term GHG reduction measures in the form of the carbon intensity indicator. This study was done by Vivian and her amazing team at MTCC, and it looks at, similarly, peculiar features of the Caribbean trade that can negatively impact the CII rating given to ships engaged in the trade. It makes a case for the review of the measure and its impact on ships engaged in the Caribbean trade, with consideration given for what is called a correction factor. We can discuss that later. And that we need additional studies on short sea shipping, on port performance, port efficiency, and other related areas. So that is in a nutshell are the 2 primary papers co-sponsored by the region, one at the ISWG meeting and one at the MEPC 82 meeting.
Bert, that was a tour de force in explaining in very concrete, technical terms, but understandable terms, what is happening and why it's so important for the Caribbean to be there. I mean, Belize has really, and I have to mention Belize, I know some of the Belize Port Authority people are here, has really been working hard with that first proposal. It joined forces with 6 countries from the Pacific to propose these measures, in particular the universal standard for the fuel, but really the economic levy proposal, which we'll talk, I'm sure Jerry will talk a lot about what are the headwinds and what are the political problems we're encountering with aspects of these proposals right now in the negotiations. And you mentioned, and you were very humble about it, some of the work that Jamaica actually worked with the MTCC to put out on that carbon intensity indicator. And we got, again, the support of many CARICOM countries in order to look more closely at how the short distances in the region mean that we are necessarily going to be more carbon emitting, and how that should be taken into account in the negotiations. And the last papers, all of this is on the new webpage, looks at, it's sort of the Caribbean is here in the negotiations. It explains the specific background to Caribbean shipping, some of which you laid out beautifully for us, Bert, in terms of the profile of the different profiles among CARICOM when it comes to shipping, but nonetheless, how important it is for us to stand together where we can in these IMO negotiations. And I would invite persons to read that background paper, but because it also talks about a new comprehensive impact assessment that is being conducted under the IMO to measure the impact of what these proposals would mean for the Caribbean. And our take on it is whatever is agreed cannot leave the Caribbean behind. So I would invite all of you, please, to have a look at these papers, share it in your networks. Now, you mentioned the wonderful work that Vivian is doing on the ground in thinking about the transition that the region needs. And Vivian, I know you've been working very hard on that paper, but more generally on the technology and the capacity of the region when it comes to decarbonization. So our question to you is, what specific advancements or innovations at the technology level, or just very basically in terms of operations, do we need for the Caribbean countries to meet the requirements under the IMO? What are the emerging technologies for the region that we can take on board? And how can we ensure that ultimately there is a balance between these new technologies and managing the major costs associated with bringing these technologies on stream? Over to you. Vivian, we cannot hear you, unfortunately. I don't know if there's a problem with your mic. I was hearing you earlier on. So it may be a problem, a technology problem. Maybe you can mute yourself and try again. No. Maybe you can try to, yeah, we're hearing a lot of like static when you try to speak. So it may be a problem with your technology, Can you figure it out? Or should we go over to Ambassador, okay, and then you'll try and figure it out in there. Because we really want to know what's happening between this balance between technology and real issues that our ports face. Okay, so whilst Vivian is getting ready to present to us, let me move to Ambassador Eno, who I know is doing a lot of work in bringing the consciousness of this issue to the populations. I see you always sharing LinkedIn information about what's happening on the ground. And my question to you is slightly different. It's about the political dimensions and the anticipated challenges in these upcoming discussions. So as we prepare to go into this new set of meetings, we're hearing that there may be some objections to the levy or some of the proposals on the table of how to disburse these funds that the levy will collect. What are the political challenges you anticipate for CARICOM? So that's at the external front. But I also want to know, you're an ambassador, so internally, how do we get more of a cohesive approach to these negotiations at the regional level among CARICOM member states, given the differences? And what strategies do you think can be employed to reach and to meet some of these collective goals of CARICOM? So the first is, how do we meander the politics at the IMO? And the second, maybe harder question is, how do we meander the politics regionally, given the different profiles of countries and the different interests of countries in shipping? Over to you.
Thank you. Very tall order, but I will do my best. I think it is important for us to firstly understand at the ground in country, the political education is critical, because this process has been in front of the Caribbean a while now. So other regions, the Pacific, the developed countries, they are well advanced. So we are playing catch up with this particular issue here, which is decarbonizing the shipping industry. But in order for us to be an effective unit at the IMO, all of our political will has to come from home, then move up the scale to the regional level. But what is important is that our policymakers at home are well educated. And I always stress that at meetings, that if our politicians are not educated on the benefits, the challenges, then somebody else who is opposing our view can run over them very easily. So it is important for us to understand and make our politicians be completely aware of what we are doing, at least on the technical level, so that they can then enlighten their counterparts. So my task is educating my foreign minister, do as much as I can to educate the prime minister, so that when we need, all of us here need the force of the political will. We need that force that go ahead to go to IMO and negotiate on the behalf of the country. So in order for them to support us, obviously they need to be educated. So education at the local level, our policymakers are completely aware of what we want to do, what's the target, what's the benefit, so that they can stand up when an opposing view is placed before them, right? Then the other great thing is, if we have that unity among the region, the leaders, we have a unified directive going into IMO. And I think that would be the most important and most powerful position that we get. If we can get a unified position based on a collective goal. But we have to understand, though, that that might be a challenge for itself, because you have different political interests from different regions, having different say in different countries in the region. So it is important that we understand. And that is even the more difficult challenge, because the technical and the scientific part, the scientists can all agree on what's next, what's not, what should happen, what shouldn't happen. But the most difficult challenge is the political cohesion. If you don't have that political cohesion, then you're in major problems, because you would have a fragmented approach going to CARICOM. So I think for us who are within a political organization or government, it's important that we educate our ministers, our prime ministers, as to the benefits of what we are trying to do, the drawbacks of what we are trying to do, so that they are in a position where they can have that sort of a well-educated position. Because for us, as small island state, it's important that we have a collective voice, but that collective voice still has the individual countries in it. So getting a collective voice is most important for us, for CARICOM, for the OECS in the region here. But it is important that we basically prioritize the education of our political directorate. Because if they are not adequately informed of what we are doing, then it's pointless. So the go-ahead needs to come from the political directorate, and they need to empower us. So education at the inside of the country, followed by that collective goal that everyone has. So I think basically that's the main challenge that we see. It is, I mean, we can go on and on about the different intricacies of what we're trying to do, but I think overall, the objective here is that we have that collective voice, because if you have that cohesion, then it would be much more difficult for opposing view to get through 15 or 20 sovereign countries having one position at IMO. So I think it's important that, I mean, we have the mechanisms, we have CARICOM, we have OECS that can play a critical role in galvanizing our position. So I think the education from where I sit to the minister, to the prime minister, and then to the overall CARICOM. So I think each of us here who represents a government entity is important that we do the same thing so that we come up with the same answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I think, you know, just to shout out to yourself and all the others that I'm seeing online that are actually representing countries in these IMO negotiations, and how important it is to not just represent the countries, but as you say, go back into their home governments and educate at the person level, so to the general public, but also to the persons who ultimately make policy. And I think that's a very strong message about education. And this is exactly what this webinar is trying to do, is to bring some of these technical issues to light. Because I think a lot of people think they hear shipping and their eyes glaze over. But I see you nodding your head. It's not a sexy topic, but increasingly I'm hearing, because it's now merging with climate and levies, which means a lot of potential revenues for decarbonization, not just in sector, but out of sector. This is one of the fights happening, is should the monies go back to the ships and the ship owners who are undertaking the decarbonization and the technology to decarbonize, or this is the position that the smaller islands take, should it go out of sector, so to the ports and to the roads and to the infrastructure and the broader economy that actually needs to adapt and decarbonize in order for us to be ready for the low carbon transition. So I agree that it starts with educating our own, so that when we speak in front of these committees and at these committees, that we're really doing it from a position of strength and knowledge, and educated people back in our region who are able. And when we say education, it's not about ignorance. It's that everybody is in their own silos. So if you're doing climate, you're doing climate. If you're doing trade, you're doing trade. If you're doing finance, you're doing finance. But what we're seeing with the climate, Jerry, because that's where you sit, is it's actually permeating a lot of other areas of governance. And so we need to start talking across the silos to each other. So thank you for the work that you do. So I see that, Vivian, you're back. Fingers crossed we can hear you.
I hope so. How is this?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So just to ask you again about the technology and what's happening on the ground in terms of decarbonization and the technology and the balance between the cost for our ships and the ultimately the needs of our region in order to decarbonize. So over to you.
Okay. So when Bert started his contribution, one of the things he underscored was the diverging interests of the various Caribbean states. And inherent in that is the private sector interests and the very nature of sometimes the competing interests of Caribbean states. So we have flag states that are major registries in the region. We have countries, and these flag states, they may be major registries, but they're not necessarily major ship owning states, which is why in terms of identifying the technology that is appropriate for the Caribbean states, we need to be very careful about who we are speaking about. Are we speaking about Caribbean ship owners, Caribbean registered ships? Because the technology that is applicable to each of these categories may vary. And we need to understand these relationships to understand which of these is actually most beneficial to the Caribbean region. And what is most beneficial to the Caribbean region may not necessarily be beneficial to every single Caribbean state. So what we need to identify is the opportunities and to be able to classify which of these are most beneficial to the states and somehow come to some sort of consensus as to what is the technology we want to champion for the region. There are some of them that are already being deployed in the region, well, at least at the very least, proposals for their deployment within the region that we've done through some of the IMO projects that we've been participating in. But again, that technology is always a question of scale. Take, for example, some of the digital technology that is available. That may not be applicable to some of the Caribbean ports because the ports may not have the traffic or the throughput to be able to justify the implementation of very advanced, sophisticated technology that has been proven to use in major ports. So the applicability of that technology to the scale of Caribbean ports is very important. It's also appropriate to understand that in terms of the nature of shipping, what we identify as Caribbean shipping may be vastly different depending on who you ask. If you ask somebody from Caribbean, from Trinidad and Tobago, who are some of the major ship owners, you would be surprised that a lot of them may come up with offshore supply vessel operators whose interests may not mirror that of other Caribbean shipping interests. So our freight forwarders may have a very different perspective as to what constitutes Caribbean shipping, and therefore the identification of the technology that is suitable to their operations will also differ. So the point with respect to technology must be appropriate and it must be suitable based on whether you are a ship owner operating in the Caribbean, a vessel registered to the Caribbean region, the interest might be vastly different. Whether you're asking a port operator, what is the applicable technology? And just to highlight some of the technology that we've been involved in bringing to the Caribbean. And again, their suitability is still under conversation and discussion. Through the IMO CARES project that some of you may know, we were involved in a technology challenge that saw various technology providers submitting proposals that were eventually shortlisted for the maritime technology centers and the IMO to consider for deploying within the Caribbean region. One of them is a wind turbine to support port decarbonization operations in St. Kitts. Another is digital technology to support logistic and port operations within the ambit of our National Energy Corporation. The suitability of these technologies is under discussion, as I mentioned. Scale is important, but what we've realized, a good question to ask, and I have to thank my deputy director for asking this question, would you invest in this technology if you did not have this funding? Is this something that makes commercial sense for you as a port operator or a ship owner? If the answer is yes, then you have your answer. That is the suitable technology. So, there are a lot of technology that is available promoting decarbonization in the sector, but we have to understand its applicability to the region and understand whether that can actually be replicated successfully and sustainably within the Caribbean region. And identifying the pool of technology that is suitable to the Caribbean has not been done really. We've done it in terms of our national interests. We've done it in a very cursory manner in but we've not done it as a region in terms of putting hard figures in place as what will be the cost of deploying this technology to a particular country, to the region. And there is opportunity here as a region. If collectively we have identified a technology that we believe will help us decarbonize, maybe collectively there's an opportunity for us to negotiate, build upon our limited economies of scale in shipping to, bargain for technology that can be deployed on a regional basis. So, technology deployment comes down to a lot of economics and whether it makes economic sense. Because the technology has to make economic sense for it to be sustainable. Even if you were to get funding and seed funding for deployment of technology, if a private sector or government player has to take over use of that technology, it must be sustainable and it must make commercial sense.
Vivian, I'm going to ask you a direct question because you're in Trinidad and I've heard certain things about green hydrogen. And we know that there is definitely a push towards utilization by ships of, organic fuels, or these e-fuels or these hydrogen fuels. Is there any scope, again, that makes sense economically for investing and advancing technology in the fuels that Caribbean ships or even other ships that we can export that fuel can use in this big decarbonization push?
So we have been having conversations with a major methanol provider that currently produces gray methanol in Trinidad. They are amongst the top 5 producers in methanol. In fact, Trinidad is amongst the top 5 methanol producers in the world. Methanol is increasingly being used as a fuel, lower carbon fuel. There is opportunity, I think that one of the most feasible alternative fuels is for blue methanol, using our existing infrastructure and creating a cleaner fuel based on offsetting of the carbon associated with its production. So I see blue methanol emerging, and a lot of that is really dependent on the partnerships being formed, because a lot of our methanol, ammonia, and these sort of products are generally subject to long-term contracts. So they are not, bunkering methanol is a side project that you're going to have to engage. With respect to hydrogen and green hydrogen, we have projects in the pipeline that are very much maybe 5 years away. How that translates for opportunities in the shipping sector. There are some proven cases, but I don't see it really being feasible in the short term. And given the aggressive timeline for maritime decarbonization, I think there's need for a lot of speed with respect to the use of hydrogen as a marine fuel. And I don't see its deployment necessarily being successful as a region. There are pockets of it being adopted by different vessel operators. But, it's small pockets. I have not seen a business case successfully making hydrogen as an alternative fuel in shipping within the context of the Caribbean or Latin America or any of the SIDS.
Thank you. This was wonderful. This was a first round of questions that I think has raised a lot of questions. It's really focused on the Caribbean situation, and happily it's focused on the Caribbean situation. I wanted to open up the floor at this point to any questions from the audience. There is a Q&A tab where you can register any questions you have. Any of the technicalities you don't understand, don't hesitate to ask these very knowledgeable people. But whilst we're waiting for these questions, I wondered if Bert or Jerry or Vivian, you had any comments to make on each other's presentations, and also whether there is anything in particular to go back to the negotiations, which are happening at the end of this month, whether anything you anticipate, we haven't talked a lot about the new proposals on the table that are going to be discussed, including, as I think I mentioned, a proposal for how to distribute some of the revenues that the Pacific has come up with. You know, obviously there are some legal technicalities about how the monies can be used, whether it has to be disbursed by the IMO, whether some of the monies can actually be utilized and sent to the Green Climate Fund or other funds that are more generally set up outside of the IMO to disburse funds, whether it goes to SIDS as disproportionately negatively impacted sectors and countries, whether it should be more generally spread among all countries, and whether it should go more to the ship owners. I mean, these are some of the things that we need to discuss and think about, and that those who are actually engaged in the negotiations are thinking about. But I'm just curious whether anything we've missed to tell the public here about what's happening. Go ahead, Bert, and then Jerry.
Right. So I think one of the takeaway points is that we need some more studies to be done. We need academia to come on board to do studies on how these measures are going to impact the states. How are we going to use the revenues that are going to be disbursed? I think we have an opportunity, having come together. We have trade now, we have legal, we have technical, we have maritime persons on the team. And I think that's an opportunity for us to not only negotiate as a block, but share our different expertise to help us to come to common positions. I think if we don't have the data on the impact of the levy on particular states, it's going to be a challenge. UNCTAD has done a study, but I think they use
I was going to say,
Trinidad,
but we have to mention what has been done.
Right, they use Trinidad and Domrep. Yes, that's the Caribbean. But as I mentioned earlier, we have different interests. So I think we need further studies to be done on the impact of these measures on the other states, because we need that data to be able to negotiate with an informed position. But I think we have an opportunity through the center, through UN foundations, led by Belize. I think we now have an opportunity to negotiate on block.
Yes.
The IMO member states, they negotiate in blocks. Prior to this, they did not have any interest in talking to the Caribbean as individual states. Now they're coming to us to share their positions. Why? Because we have negotiated as a bloc. We have our country interests that we can share from the floor, but because we have come together, we have an opportunity now to influence the debate, but we need further studies. And so academia has to come on board to support or backstop us.
Bert, you make some great points, and I know, Ambassador, you know, you have, and I'm going between first names and titles, so excuse me, but, you know, we've become, I say, friends since we started working together on this. But I know Carolina is going to have the final word, and I hope she talks a little bit about the studies that have already been done that are indeed aggregate, because the UNCTAD and DNV, two entities, are part of the process to begin to estimate the impact of the proposed measures on different countries. And the Caribbean, some states have been factored in and some have been aggregated. And we do have some results about what the impacts of these measures will be that are in the paper I referenced, that we set out what these are. But certainly what we're seeing other countries do is begin to go behind the aggregate and start to really try to figure out, based on the data that does exist. And I know we have a data problem, but there are ways to get at some of the data and begin to estimate the impacts, because then we are in a better position to make the positions that we do take at the IMO more justifiable based on studies that we're doing. And so we are engaging in that process. Part of this is to engage in that process more holistically and more intentionally. And we have to thank UNF, Foundations, Belize Port Authority, and MTCC, and all of the delegates who have already begun the work. I don't want it to sound like it hasn't started. It has started, but we just need to galvanize these efforts. I did see a question. I'm going to read it out. Maybe, Jerry, you can bring it in your response. Well, there are 3 questions now. One is, does anyone have a sense of the proportion of vessels owned by nationals from the Caribbean versus those registered in Caribbean countries? So the difference between indigenous ownership and flag states. This is some of the first work that we actually want to do, is to begin to look under the hood and estimate what that is. A second question is, how are we engaging the private sector in these discussions? Very important, from Patricia Francis. And then Jessica, can you, who is a seasoned Barbadian negotiator, can you speak a little bit about the impact of the decarbonization on port operations, especially as some of our ports are more developed than others? So these are 3 questions that I think we have maybe 10 minutes left on the webinar. I'll open up to all of the panelists to take any of these questions, and then let's leave some time at the end for Curleen to give her final thoughts. So maybe I'll start with you, Ambassador, and then maybe you, Vivian, and Bert.
So I will go backwards. But before I answer that question, I wanted to just share some context as to what we're looking at in decarbonizing the shipping industry. The alternative fuel production globally, in some cases, if we were to, the shipping industry were to move toward one particular alternative fuel, it would more or less require all of the fuel production in that fuel, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, methanol. In most cases, the production that is being done now is already being consumed by other forms of development and so on, and manufacturing and so on. So we have to contextualize what is happening, is that we will need excess fuel, alternative fuel, for us to account for what is happening in the shipping industry if we want to transition, because all of the reports, all of the studies, all the DNV studies, all of the maritime insights, forecast, and so on is predicting that if we were to move to one particular alternative fuel, we would require either 10% or 100% of the production of that fuel, which some of it is being consumed already by manufacturing, by other industries. So I just wanted for us to have that bit of a context that when we go into this, is that these are the things that we need to be mindful of. And the final, the question, what was the question? The last question.
The last question was, can you speak about what's happening in the ports, the decarbonization?
Yes, so and that's another critical thing that we need to look at. The alternative fuels that we're looking at, some of them, I spoke about that in Belize a few months ago. They require different management. We have to take into account everything. If you look at the fire suppressant, what is required for a methanol fire, for a hydrogen fire, right now, all our ports are basically geared towards treating fires that emerge from heavy oil, from ships and so on, from that kind of fires. Now, just a simple fact of moving towards 2 alternative fuels and the firefighting suppressant technology needed for those 2 different fires comes at a cost. This is something that is not being looked at now, but you would have to have a different set of firefighting equipment, a different set of training, and all these things comes at a cost. And these are some of the minor costs that is associated with the transition that we need to look at from on the ground. So the port readiness, as it was briefly mentioned, some of the ports in the Caribbean are more advanced, more the infrastructure is younger. So you have that challenge by itself, the uniformity across the region. Not all ports are up to the same standard. So it is something that we need to be cognizant of as well.
Thank you so much for giving very real examples, Ambassador. Always, always keeping it real. Over to you, Vivian. I see one of your colleagues has actually asked a question, which is combined with how do we get the private sector in, and do we have a sense of the ownership spread between indigenous and flag states? There's another question there. I think somebody answered it. Given the unique challenges faced by SIDS and the financial challenges, how can CARICOM advocate for changes to criteria used in identifying official development assistance recipient countries so we ensure that SIDS can actually benefit? And I bear in mind there is now acceptance of the multi-dimensional vulnerability index at the UN, which may be one step in the right direction. But again, you can take any of these questions and give your final remarks.
Okay, so with respect to disaggregating the data on vessels that are flagged to the Caribbean and vessel ownership within the Caribbean, we are happy to disaggregate that if states are willing to share the data. Our biggest challenge is getting the data from the countries so that we can help them help themselves. So, and it is possible to probably subscribe to expensive databases and get the data and mine it to answer that question. But right now, we don't have that information, off the cuff. That probably exists, as I said, in very expensive database that we subscribe to occasionally if we have the funding to do it. I think the role of the private sector is very important, and it plays a significant role, especially in the port sector within the region. I mean, it is easier to identify the Caribbean port ownership than Caribbean ship ownership. And in that regard, I think, because scale is very important with respect to the adoption of technology and financing of technology, for the region, I think the larger ports will, within their respective territories, could be identified as a first option for decarbonization because they may have, or at least be closer to the scale required for use of the technology. And then secondly, in terms of accessing financing for decarbonization, the private sector is fundamentally better at recovering costs and managing their operations in a profitable manner, and at least an economically feasible manner. They would not have the governmental hurdles and the political agenda, so they are able to work with greater agility. And I think that the private sector has to be involved somehow in terms of when we are identifying the use of funding. If these funding are to materialize through the universal levy, it is very important that committees are set up at the regional and national level so that we can identify where is and what is the best use for that funding, taking into account both national and regional interests. And that's a very tall order, and it's going to require the research that Bert has identified. So it's really, really critical that we involve the private sector, and some of them are already involved in the ports, and they are the change makers. They are possibly going to be the change makers much faster than government operated ports.
Thank you so much. I'm just cognizant of the time. We have about 6 minutes left. Bert, since you had to go, I'm going to keep you short in your final words.
So there's this question about indigenous ship owners vis-a-vis owners that are on your registry. I think the focus, though, is on the ships trading in the region. The ships carrying our energy or passengers or commodities, whether they're owned by Caribbean nationals or foreigners, those are the ships that we have to focus on, because if they do not retrofit because they're elderly, or if they're penalized because they receive an adverse CII rating because they have to wait at anchorage or at the berth because of poor port infrastructure, we're going to be impacted. So the focus has to be on whether you're foreign flag, local flag, owned by Caribbean national or not. The focus is on the ships that are trading in the region. In respect of ports, ports play a key role. And if they're not efficient, then, as I mentioned before, the vessels are going to get an adverse CI rating, and that will have a negative impact on their ability to decarbonize, and they will pass their costs on to us in the freight. My closing remark, though, is that CARICOM needs to be more engaged. We have quoted, but shipping cannot be an AOB on the agenda. It can't be, there's a project today, let us discuss it. Shipping has to be front and center on the agenda. Or politicians like numbers. So we need data about the contribution of shipping to our economies. Percentage of GDP, persons employed. If we don't have that tombstone data, it is difficult for people to connect to the importance of shipping in the region. And I see Vivian wanting to.
I do, Bert. I'm sorry to
guys, we
interrupt
have to
you.
close it off soon,
But
please.
I do have to say one thing about the ships trading in the region, because if our focus is on ships trading in the region, we have to understand that we might see revenues that were targeted for SIDS being deployed to vessels trading in the region where the beneficial owner actually sits in Europe or the Americas. So we have to be careful when we are saying and identifying potential beneficiaries. We understand that all vessels trading in the region above the 400 gross ton has to decarbonize for all our mutual benefit. But we have to be careful of understanding when we are targeting our players for to be a beneficiary of this funding, that we are targeting ships that are trading in the region, but ships that are also owned and operated by Caribbean nationals. Otherwise, there is opportunity to involve persons that are external to the region, but that's a whole other webinar that we're going to have with respect to understanding it.
Well, the wonderful thing is this is not a one-off. As I mentioned today, we've launched Caribbean Shipping Lanes, where there'll be lots of opportunity to dissect every single point that was wonderfully made by the panelists, with all the nuances and all of the depth of expertise. And let me just say, we do know the importance of trade and shipping to the region. We just had a global supply chain conference in Barbados to discuss that. That's why I'm saying we have information at our disposal. It's just in pockets. It's all over the place. And part of the idea behind this is to bring a lot of this information together, because there are people with expertise in many parts of this puzzle, and we're not speaking enough to each other. So I think we need to start at least figuring out what we do have and where we can come together and make positions known. And that's a great segue to Curleen Wills. You've heard about the phenomenal work UN Foundations has been doing to bring the Caribbean's positions together, bring the technical positions together, bring the people together. And that a lot of that is thanks to Curleen for the work she's been doing with the Caribbean. The delegates owe a lot to her, as well as the region policymakers. So the final word, actually, I will thank everyone afterwards, goes to Curleen to wrap it all up. And I see that there is a question to you that's from Kyla Jones. So if you can wrap that up into your answer, into your last 3-4 minutes, we'll extend the webinar by 4 minutes for you. Please go ahead and answer the question.
Yes, thank you so much, Jan, and thank you so much to everyone for being on this panel. I'd like to start off by saying, as you can see, the Caribbean is not a monolith. And it's a very good example of what is happening at the IMO in terms of where different interests lie, but how the region is coming together to see how we can transition the industry, given our different interests. So I just want to say how proud I am to see from where this project came from a year ago, where we were just discussing ideas, and I was troubling both Bert and Vivian's soul every day to where we are now, to having webinars and trainings for the region, and to see the different delegates coming together to pull, the different ideas, even incorporating the private sector into the discussion to see what are your interests and how does this what do these impacts mean? What do the impacts of the measures mean? And thank you also very much to the Belize Port Authority for raising their hand and leading the way when I came down knocking on doors on who wants to kick this off. So, I mean, I think that we had some very interesting things being discussed today. We talked about how the CARICOM is not homogenous. You have large flag states, you have the countries that are heavily reliant on transshipment, heavily reliant on their the export of seafarers, and all of these things become important when talking about the just and equitable transition. Some of the things that really were highlighted were the need for further studies to be done, the need to break down some of what came out of UNCTAD's comprehensive impact assessment and what that means for different countries in the region. And I'm happy to say that in the partnership that the UN Foundation is doing along with the Sridhar Ramphal Center, these are top of mind in terms of next steps for what we will be doing at in the context of this project. And our partners in the different countries and at the MTCC and the Caribbean Maritime University will be integral to ensuring that these studies are meaningful to the negotiators at the IMO. We also heard from Jerry the importance of political will. So part of the work that we do support at UN Foundation is engaging engaging countries to have these political discussions on the ground with the different stakeholders, and even thinking about not just nationally, who needs to be at the table, but regionally, how can we get that to the heads of government? So this has been integral as part of the work and the groundwork that we have been doing as UN Foundation, SRC, MTCC, even incorporating the CARICOM Secretariat into the discussions. Everyone must be at the table, especially as we talk about, like you said, what happens with revenues later on. So I noticed that Kyler did post a question to me in the chat, and I wanted to say that for his first two questions, I definitely think that the submission to the MEPC on the CII can definitely answer some of those questions. And if not, I would recommend that the MTCC, given the work that they've done on CII, would be the lead to answer that question. Not to put you on the spot right now, Vivian, but to say that given the submission that they supported in doing for the region, they would be the best to answer. And on the last part about explorations of different options other than the levy, I think that UNCTAD and DNV did a really great initial comprehensive impact study that looked at different scenarios, given different situations, and what the different impacts would be. And although those findings initially are at a global level, it still highlighted that the levy was the most efficient way to transition the industry. So I think on a micro level, and this is where the further studies come in, is how are we looking at how that impacts particular states and particular sectors that are important to states, and that can look more at the trickle down to individuals, as Kyler pointed out in his question. So I hope that answers your question, Kyler. And last, I did want to come back to Michael because he asked about ODA. And I think that we should, I just want to highlight, because from my time working in Guyana, one of the strongest CARICOM positions has always been that GNI and GDP per capita is not representative of the impacts on our states. So this is something that we have to continue to even emphasize in the context of the IMO when we get into discussions on, revenue disbursement, when we get into discussions on talking about impacts, that we ensure that the criteria that are used in ODA that have traditionally kept the CARICOM out of the discussions or out of the ability to access financing, that they're not then replicated in the context of the IMO. So and you have that mandate from the heads of government. So just to let you know, in the context of the IMO, if that comes up, you do have heads backing to defend. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. The UN Foundation is glad to be a part of this, and we hope to continue this partnership with you, with the SRC, with NTCC, with the member states to ensure that the Caribbean voice continues to be heard in the context of these negotiations, and that there's even stronger voices from small island developing states to be present and participating at the IMO. So thank you, Yaniv.
Thank you, Curleen. And guys, we went 5 minutes over, but not one person has defected, which means that there is an appetite for this sort of work. There's an appetite in the region for collaboration. There's an appetite for leadership. There is an appetite for teamwork. There's an appetite for us to be strong in these negotiations. And I want to thank, first of all, our panelists who did an amazing job, and that includes you, Curling, and bringing it all together in helping to demystify the negotiations, but bringing your wealth of knowledge and your passion for the region to the fore here, and giving us the clarion call we need to educate each other, but also to educate our politicians about why this is so important. Let me also thank our collaborators, the UNF, obviously, the Belize Port Authority, MTCC, UCL, all of those who work in the trenches, and our CARICOM negotiators at the IMO, and all of you who work in the maritime sector and the maritime government sector and the private sector to make this issue real and live for us. Let me thank you all for holding the flag. You've been holding it for us, and now we need to follow you. I also want to, you're not supposed to do this, but I do need to thank the team at the SRC for making this happen. I want to thank Tiana Blades for helping to put this webinar together, our IMO fellow, Nafisha Richardson, also lovely work in also helping us to bring all the thinking together with Tiana, and Adila Lewis for helping to launch the website with Jerome Brooms and Tennille, all of the long nights and the 2 a.m. texts. I do need to thank you all for tolerating all of us, and the broader team behind the project, Professor Troy Lord, Desiree Evelyn, and Clausel Ford, for all of the team that's made this possible. Thank you all so much. Let me also thank Samuel Eugene and the IT team for making this a safe space for us to talk. And look out for our Caribbean shipping lanes. Go on our website. We'll be talking about it. We'll be updating it. Look out for, if you want to contribute anything to the website, you have thoughts from the private sector. I see some of our private sector friends here, or the public sector, and you have something to say, we will be happy to feature you on our Caribbean Shipping Lanes website, because it is for you. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you at another one of our webinars, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Bye-bye. And the recording will be made available on our website, so look out for it. Thank you, everyone.